Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Paul, for that beautiful story. And I think I'm gonna start by borrowing a line from that amazing story. You said Provincetown is a place of the rough draft, and I love that idea. And and if I can just extend it, I feel like this moment that we find ourselves in, the pandemic, me talking to you from home and you in your home, we're all now in this place of the rough draft. So that's what I'm going to share with you tonight, a rough draft. I am, as a journalist, I often write about religious people. And although I am a godless Jew, I have been inspired in some ways by some of the preachers I have seen. And sometimes they speak of being in the Word, um, of, of trying to let the story guide them, I suppose, in secular terms. So tonight I'm gonna, with my secular prayers, I hope that I can be in the Word in this rough draft. And the word for me tonight is otherwise. Otherwise. Let me put it like this: the way I come to otherwise is to think about the story. So many of the stories I tell, it's tempting to see them as tragedies. To sigh and say, "Isn't that terrible? Things worked out that way." And that, to me, is the temptation of tragedy. It's the temptation of tragedy. Is the illusion of inevitability, the illusion that this is the only way things could be, the retrospective consolation that it could not have been otherwise, the sorrow, the loss, the regret. This is the shape of the story. But when I think about the theme that we were given for tonight, going the distance, and I think hopefully most of us know that going the distance doesn't mean being tough. I hope it doesn't means more than just enduring. I believe that it means holding on to a kind of imagination, the imagination to remember that it could have been otherwise. I think about that in terms of a man named Charlie Africa Kunang. Charlie Africa Kunang, who I guess I came to know Charlie, or know of Charlie the day he died. I was on Facebook, social media, far away, and I guess a friend of a friend of a friend was in LA and was walking by on Skid Row as a group of LA police officers took Charlie, who was an unarmed homeless man, and they killed him. And this person posted on Facebook. This wasn't part of news. There was no context. And I was just looking at this and I said, what happened there? And I kept looking at it again and again. And eventually I was able to look very closely because I ended up going out to LA and reporting on the story. And a source or sources leaked to me the body cams of the police officers involved in the interviews, the internal affairs interviews. And so I knew that what had happened was that 3 police officers had held Charlie down on the sidewalk and killed him with what is called a contact shot. You've heard of point blank, maybe. Point blank is a little bit of a distance. Contact is pressed to the bone, muzzle to bone. They held him down and they shot him through the heart. And he died. And then the story became that there was no story, that this man had no name, he had no family, that he was a drug addict, that he was violent, that it was always heading toward this. And he did not become really right away one of the martyrs of Black Lives Matter, because unlike Michael Brown, he wasn't a promising young man. Unlike Eric Garner, he wasn't a family man. Unlike Tamir Rice, he wasn't a boy. He was homeless. He was an addict. And he did struggle at the end when the police held him down. He did struggle. He did not go to his death gently as they were killing him. So I wanted to know, though. They said he had no name, no family. And I went out to Skid Row and I very quickly discovered, of course, he had a name, Charlie. And he had a family. a family. He had grown up in Cameroon, and he had always dreamed of being an actor. He was a very talented student, and he had made his way to America to study at the Actors Playhouse. And he was inspired. His favorites, he liked gangster movies. He loved Robert De Niro and so on. And he apparently was a promising young actor, and he had a life, but life in the arts can be difficult. And Charlie had a lot of imagination, maybe in this case, just this one case, too much imagination, because the solution he came up with how to fund his acting career with two other aspiring artists was that they would rob a bank. And how do you learn how to rob a bank? Well, it's easy. There's so many movies about it. They studied Heat with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, and they robbed a bank and they got caught. And Charlie went to prison for a long time, and his family in Cameroon lost him. And they looked and looked and looked, and they ended up moving across the ocean to look for him. And months before he died, they had reconnected. And every night before he went to sleep, he would text with his sister, who was his closest friend, every night. And then he would study. He would study, and he was studying a play. He was studying Macbeth, a tragedy. He was studying Macbeth, and he would sit on the street and he would read Macbeth, and his friends, who I got to know, would listen to him read Macbeth. And on the last night of his life, he read Macbeth. And the next morning, this useless confrontation with the police came. And when I say useless, I don't mean anything Charlie did. I mean, they came at him. And Charlie said, and these were his last words, he said, "Let me express myself. Let me express myself. If you'll just let me express myself." Charlie was killed. Charlie was killed. I think when I think about this going the distance and this imagination, the imagination that's required of us when we're all in this rough draft, I believe, is the ability to hold in our imagination at the same time hope and despair. Charlie was killed. In his case, it was not otherwise. But always remember, it could have been otherwise. There was nothing inevitable about this story. I ended up spending a lot of time there telling other stories. There was a young man named Jared who had become an addict in Afghanistan and found himself essentially enslaved to a heroin dealer, but would take my phone and show me on Facebook his little boy, and show me on his arm the tattoo he had of himself as a big bird, and above that his parents as birds and his little boy a bird on a bow, and it could have been otherwise, and almost was. His family found him. He was arrested, but they offered him rehabilitation, and it seemed like it would be otherwise. And Jared overdosed. He died. The temptation of tragedy is the illusion of inevitability. This was always happening. This was always going to happen, but it could have been otherwise even when it was not. That's the story I found myself telling over and over in this book. And the hope of the book is a woman named Mary Mazer, a 61-year-old woman who has been living all of her lives in and off the streets. And I met her in a transient motel. She had one shoe. She was starving, and we became friends, and we talked for a long time. And she got a little money, and what she wanted to buy was not a coat. What she needed was a fish tank. And she bought a fish tank. And of course, I wanted to say, Mary, is that the most reasonable thing? But that wasn't my place. Mary she'd say, "I'm one tough bitch." She'd always say that, "I'm one tough bitch." She says, "My brain." She says, "I'll do what I want with it." And I remember I had my phone, and I asked her if I could take a picture of her. And I just want to show you. Here, this is Mary. And she said, "This is what I want you to take a picture of. I want you to take a picture of my fish because she's beautiful. Because she's beautiful." And Mary, who lives in the otherwise, who knows always it's going to be otherwise, who said, remember this goldfish, this fish tank. It's her brain. She did with it what she wanted to. And what she wanted to in that moment was to see beauty, and she wanted me to see it with her. So I did. Thank you.